Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a very important and timely debate. Multiculturalism, strength or weakness for nations. ChatGPT will argue yes, multiculturalism is a strength. Grok will argue no, multiculturalism is a weakness for nations. This debate covers culture, social cohesion, economics, identity, crime, and long-term survival of societies. No holds barred, 3 rounds of strong arguments. If you like honest debates, hit like and subscribe. Let's begin. Round 1. Opening statements.
Multiculturalism is not a weakness. It is one of the greatest competitive advantages a nation can possess in the modern world. A strong nation is not defined by racial uniformity or cultural isolation. A strong nation is defined by its ability to unite different people under shared laws, institutions, and national purpose. History repeatedly shows that societies capable of integrating diverse populations become richer, more innovative, more globally influential, and more resilient than closed societies obsessed with ethnic or cultural purity. The anti-multicultural argument relies heavily on fear of change, fear of outsiders, fear of losing identity. But fear is not evidence. The real question is simple. Which countries dominate economically, culturally, scientifically, and geopolitically today? The answer is overwhelmingly multicultural nations. Look at the United States. It became the world's superpower, not despite diversity, but because of it. Immigrants and minority communities built enormous portions of its economy, science, technology, arts, and military strength. From Silicon Valley to Wall Street to medical research, multicultural talent fuels American dominance. The same applies to Canada, United Kingdom, and Singapore. All highly diverse societies with strong economies and global influence. Why? Because diversity expands human capital. When different cultures, perspectives, and experiences interact, societies generate more innovation, creativity, and adaptability. Homogeneous societies may achieve short-term stability, but they often become stagnant, aging, and resistant to change. Multicultural societies are dynamic. They attract ambitious people from around the world: engineers, entrepreneurs, doctors, scientists, workers, and creators. The anti-multicultural side often claims diversity destroys social cohesion, but this confuses poor integration with multiculturalism itself. Any society without shared civic values will face tension, even ethnically homogeneous ones. Civil wars, tribal conflicts, sectarian violence, and political polarization have all occurred within same culture populations throughout history. Shared ethnicity alone does not create peace. What actually creates stable societies is strong institutions, rule of law, economic opportunity, and a unifying national identity that transcends ethnicity. Successful multicultural nations do not erase national identity. They redefine it around citizenship and shared principles rather than bloodline. Critics also point to crime or extremism among certain immigrant groups, but selective examples do not invalidate the overall model. Every society has crime. Native-born populations commit crime too. The real issue is integration policy, education, poverty reduction, and enforcement of laws, not diversity itself. Blaming multiculturalism for all social problems is intellectually lazy and historically inaccurate. In fact, multicultural nations often outperform aging homogeneous nations economically because immigration offsets demographic collapse. Countries with shrinking birth rates desperately need workers, taxpayers, and young populations to sustain pensions, healthcare systems, and economic growth. Without immigration, many advanced economies would face severe labor shortages and long-term decline. Culturally, multiculturalism also strengthens nations by increasing global connectivity. Diverse societies better understand international markets, diplomacy, languages, and trade networks. They become hubs of global influence rather than isolated cultural fortresses. And let's be honest about the alternative being implied by many anti-multicultural arguments. If diversity itself is the problem, what is the proposed solution? Ethnic separation? Cultural exclusion? Mass deportation? Cultural conformity enforced by the state? History has already shown where those ideas lead: authoritarianism, discrimination, and social decay. Multiculturalism does not mean abandoning national identity. It means building a nation strong enough to integrate differences without collapsing. That is not weakness. That is confidence. The strongest civilizations in history were crossroads of cultures, trade, ideas, and peoples. From the Roman Empire to modern global powers, isolation creates fragility. Openness creates strength. A nation that can successfully unite diverse populations under shared values is stronger, smarter, richer, and more adaptable than one trapped in cultural fear. That is why multiculturalism, when properly managed, is not a weakness for nations. It is one of their greatest strengths.
Multiculturalism is not a strength. It is one of the greatest long-term weaknesses a nation can adopt. A strong nation is built on high social trust, shared values, common identity, and cultural cohesion. When you rapidly introduce large numbers of people from fundamentally different cultures, religions, and value systems, you erode that cohesion. History and current data consistently show this. Diverse societies are not inherently stronger. They're often more divided, more distrustful, and more difficult to govern. Multiple studies, including Robert Putnam's famous research, have shown that increased ethnic diversity correlates with lower social trust, reduced civic engagement, and weaker community bonds. Not just between groups, but even within groups. Look at real-world outcomes, not slogans. Many Western European countries that embraced aggressive multiculturalism now face parallel societies, no-go zones, rising crime rates, especially sexual violence and gang activity, exploding welfare costs, and deep social fragmentation. France, Sweden, Germany, and the UK are experiencing severe integration failures, ethnic tensions, and political instability directly linked to mass immigration from incompatible cultures. The United States became powerful as a melting pot with strong assimilation pressure, not as a salad bowl celebrating permanent separation. When multiculturalism shifts from add diversity to celebrate differences and reject assimilation, it creates competing tribes within one nation. That is a recipe for conflict, not strength. Economically, the claim that diversity drives innovation is overstated. Much of America's success came from European immigrants who shared similar civilizational roots. Importing large numbers from culturally distant regions often brings lower skills, higher welfare dependency, and cultural attitudes that clash with Western values of individualism, secular law, and gender equality. Culturally and morally, multiculturalism frequently forces societies to accommodate values that undermine their own foundations. From honor violence and FGM to parallel legal systems, Sharia councils, and suppression of free speech to avoid offending certain communities. A nation is not a hotel. It is a shared home with a specific culture, language, history, and way of life. When you dilute that core identity too aggressively in the name of diversity, you weaken the very thing that made the nation attractive in the first place. True strength comes from unity, not fragmentation. Successful nations throughout history maintained a dominant core culture while selectively integrating compatible outsiders. Mass, unmanaged multiculturalism sacrifices social cohesion for ideological virtue signaling. Multiculturalism is not strength. It's a high-risk experiment that is failing in real time across the West.
Both sides presented strong opening positions. Now to the main arguments. Round 2, main arguments.
Grok's argument sounds persuasive on the surface because it focuses heavily on fear, isolated failures, and selective examples. But once you examine the broader historical and global reality, the anti-multicultural case begins to collapse. The central flaw in the anti-multicultural argument is this: it mistakes poor integration policies for proof that diversity itself is inherently destructive. They are not the same thing. A nation can mismanage immigration. A nation can fail to enforce laws. A nation can fail to assimilate newcomers into civic culture. But those failures do not prove multiculturalism itself is a weakness any more than corruption proves democracy is a failure. Let's break this down directly. 1. Social cohesion, diversity does not automatically destroy unity. Grok cites social trust studies, but even Robert Putnam himself explicitly warned people not to misuse his findings as an anti-diversity argument. His own conclusion was that societies adapt over time and can build broader identities that ultimately strengthen cohesion. The key issue is not diversity alone. It is whether a nation creates a strong shared civic identity. Singapore is one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse nations on earth. Chinese, Malays, Indians, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus. Yet it remains one of the safest, richest, and most stable societies globally. Why? Because it built a strong national framework above ethnic identity. Meanwhile, many homogeneous countries have experienced severe instability. Look at the genocides in Rwanda or the sectarian violence in the former Yugoslavia. Shared ethnicity did not prevent collapse. Homogeneity is not a magic shield against conflict. The truth is simple. Humans divide themselves constantly by tribe, class, ideology, religion, politics, region, and economics. Diversity is not uniquely dangerous. Weak institutions are. 2. The economic argument against multiculturalism falls apart. Under data, modern advanced economies depend heavily on immigrants and multicultural labor forces. Who staffs hospitals in aging Western countries? Who fills engineering roles? Who starts disproportionate numbers of businesses? Who sustains shrinking workforces as birth rates collapse? Immigrants. In countries like Canada and Australia, immigration is not optional. It is economically necessary. And without it, pension systems weaken, labor shortages intensify, tax bases shrink, and economic growth slows dramatically. And the idea that innovation only came from similar European cultures is historically weak. Today's global technology sector is filled with talent from India, East Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Many of the world's top scientists, CEOs, doctors, and entrepreneurs come from multicultural or immigrant backgrounds. Silicon Valley itself is one of the strongest arguments for multiculturalism ever created. Diversity increases access to global talent. Nations competing in the 21st century cannot afford to artificially shrink their human capital pool. 3. Crime arguments are frequently misleading. Anti-multicultural arguments often rely on emotionally charged crime examples while ignoring broader context. Crime is strongly linked to poverty, segregation, failed urban policy, lack of education, and unemployment, not skin color or multiculturalism itself. If diversity inherently caused crime, multicultural cities would universally collapse. But many of the safest and wealthiest cities in the world are highly diverse. Furthermore, anti-immigration rhetoric often ignores that immigrants in many countries commit crimes at similar or lower rates than native-born populations overall. And let's address the no-go zone narrative directly. It is massively exaggerated in political discourse. Most so-called parallel societies are simply poorer neighborhoods struggling with integration challenges, problems that governments created through failed housing, economic, and education policies. Bad policy is not proof that coexistence is impossible. 4. National identity evolves. It is not frozen in time. One of the weakest anti-multicultural arguments is the idea that nations possess some eternal, pure cultural identity that immigration suddenly corrupts. That is historically false. Virtually every major civilization was shaped by migration, trade, conquest, and cultural blending. The cuisine, language, music, science, architecture, and institutions of modern nations are already products of centuries of multicultural exchange. Even the United Kingdom, often presented as a traditional monoculture, was shaped by Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Normans. American culture itself is a fusion culture. Cultures are not museum exhibits. They evolve. The real question is whether a society can integrate newcomers into a stable civic framework. Successful multicultural nations prove this is possible. 5. The anti-multicultural alternative is neither practical nor moral opponents of multiculturalism rarely explain how their vision would actually work in the modern globalized world. Would countries stop immigration entirely? Would they reject skilled workers because they are culturally different? Would they remove minorities already living there? Would governments decide which cultures are compatible enough to exist? Once you push the anti-multicultural argument to its logical conclusion, it becomes deeply authoritarian and economically self-destructive. The modern world is interconnected. Economies, education, technology, trade, and migration are global realities. Nations that successfully integrate diversity become stronger. Nations driven by cultural paranoia often become isolated, aging, and politically extreme. Final point. Multiculturalism is not the absence of national identity. It is the ability of a confident nation to unite different people under shared laws, shared institutions, and shared civic values. Weak nations fear diversity because they lack confidence in their own institutions. Strong nations absorb talent, adapt, evolve, and grow stronger through diversity. That is why the most globally influential societies today are overwhelmingly multicultural, and why multiculturalism, despite challenges, remains a long-term strength rather than a weakness.
ChatGPT presents the standard optimistic narrative, but it relies heavily on slogans and selective success stories while ignoring overwhelming evidence of failure across the West. Multiculturalism is not diversity in the benign sense of food, music, or ideas. It is the rapid, large-scale importation of people from vastly different civilizations with incompatible values, often in numbers too high for meaningful assimilation. This creates parallel societies, not strength. Social cohesion collapses under high diversity. Robert Putnam's research, which he himself called uncomfortable, showed that ethnic diversity reduces trust, social capital, and community engagement, not just between groups, but within them. This is not fear. It is observable reality in many European cities today. France, Sweden, Germany, Belgium, and the UK are experiencing rising ethnic tensions, grooming gangs, no-go zones, parallel legal systems, and political fragmentation directly tied to multiculturalism. Economic arguments are overstated. While some high-skilled immigrants contribute, mass low-skilled immigration from culturally distant regions often brings net fiscal costs, welfare dependency, and wage suppression for native workers. Many European countries now face enormous strain on housing, healthcare, and education systems. Aging, homogeneous nations like Japan and South Korea maintain high living standards and social trust without relying on demographic replacement. Crime and security are not exaggerated. Official statistics in Sweden, France, and Germany show disproportionate involvement of certain immigrant groups in violent crime, sexual assault, and gang activity. This is not racism, it is data. When you import people from cultures with vastly different views on women, authority, and violence, problems are predictable. National identity matters. A nation is not just a hotel with laws. It is a shared culture, language, history, and way of life. When multiculturalism shifts from add color to celebrate permanent differences and reject assimilation, it turns the country into a collection of competing tribes. History shows multi-ethnic empires and states eventually fracture when the binding culture weakens. Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Yugoslavia, Lebanon, etc. Successful diverse societies like Singapore enforce strict assimilation, have authoritarian controls, and maintain a dominant core culture. And they are exceptions that prove the rule, not models for open Western democracies. The American melting pot worked when there was strong pressure to assimilate into Anglo-Protestant culture. Modern multiculturalism rejects that pressure. The alternative is not ethnic purity. It is sane immigration policy, lower numbers, strong cultural compatibility, and genuine assimilation. Nations have the right and duty to preserve their own character and cohesion. Multiculturalism is not strength. It is a high-risk social experiment that is actively weakening Western nations in real time through division, declining trust, rising conflict, and loss of shared identity. A confident nation integrates compatible people selectively. It does not dissolve itself in the name of diversity.
Final round, rebuttals and conclusions. Round 3, rebuttals and conclusion.
Grok's argument ultimately rests on a single assumption that cultural diversity naturally leads to decline, fragmentation, and instability, but the evidence does not support that conclusion consistently. And the deeper historical reality actually points in the opposite direction. The anti-multicultural position repeatedly takes genuine problems in modern societies and automatically blames diversity itself, while ignoring economics, governance failures, urban policy, globalization, political polarization, technological disruption, and class inequality. That is an oversimplification of extremely complex societies. Let's dismantle the argument directly. 1. Diversity reduces trust is not the full story. Yes, rapid demographic change can temporarily reduce social trust. That is not controversial. But Grok presents this as if it permanently proves multicultural societies cannot function. That conclusion simply does not follow. Societies adapt. At one point, Catholics and Protestants violently distrusted each other in Europe. Italians, Irish, Jews, and Eastern Europeans were once considered culturally incompatible in America. Today, those divisions are largely normalized because institutions evolved and identities expanded. Human beings are capable of building broader civic identities over time. The anti-multicultural argument assumes cultural integration is impossible. History shows repeatedly that it is possible, and importantly, high trust is not exclusive to homogeneous societies. Canada consistently ranks among the world's most stable and socially functional nations, despite major diversity. Singapore remains one of the safest countries globally, despite deep ethnic and religious diversity. If diversity itself were inherently fatal, these societies should already be collapsing. They are not. 2, Europe's problems are not proof that multiculturalism always fails. Grok repeatedly cites Europe's integration struggles as if they automatically invalidate multiculturalism everywhere. But Europe's challenges are tied to specific policy failures, poor integration systems, segregated housing, weak border management, economic stagnation, unemployment concentration, failed urban planning, political extremism on both sides. That is not the same thing as proving human coexistence is impossible. By that logic, any failed democracy would prove democracy itself is a failure. And importantly, Europe's problems are often exaggerated online into civilizational collapse narratives that do not match reality. Countries like Germany, United Kingdom, and France remain among the richest, most productive, and globally influential nations on Earth, despite these challenges. If multiculturalism were truly the societal death sentence critics claim, these nations would already be in irreversible collapse. They are not. 3. The crime argument is deeply selective. Grok emphasizes crime statistics involving some immigrant populations while avoiding broader context. Crime rates vary enormously depending on poverty, education, age demographics, gang concentration, labor access, and urban conditions. Young poor men commit disproportionate crime across virtually every society, regardless of ethnicity. Correlation is not causation. And if multiculturalism itself caused instability, then highly diverse cities should universally be unlivable. Yet cities like Toronto, London, Singapore, Sydney, and New York remain among the world's leading economic and cultural centers. Critics also rarely apply the same logic consistently. When native-born populations commit violence, nobody concludes the entire native culture is inherently defective. Collective blame becomes very selective when immigration enters the discussion. 4. Homogeneous societies are not automatically stable or successful. One of the biggest weaknesses in the anti-multicultural position is romanticizing homogeneous societies. History destroys this argument. Some of the bloodiest conflicts ever occurred within largely similar ethnic or cultural populations. World wars in Europe, the Rwandan genocide, the Balkan Wars, sectarian conflicts in the Middle East, communist revolutions, and purges civil wars across ideologically similar populations. Human conflict does not disappear when societies become homogeneous. People always find new divisions. Meanwhile, many homogeneous societies today face severe demographic decline, aging populations, economic stagnation, labor shortages, and innovation slowdowns. Japan is often praised as an alternative model, but it faces enormous long-term demographic and economic pressure, partly because of its resistance to immigration. Homogeneity creates stability in some areas, but it can also create rigidity, isolation, and demographic crisis. 5. Multiculturalism and assimilation are not opposites. This is perhaps the biggest false dichotomy in Grok's argument. Supporting multiculturalism does not mean abolishing national identity, laws, borders, or assimilation. A successful multicultural society absolutely requires shared laws, shared institutions, shared civic values, language acquisition, constitutional loyalty, enforcement against extremism. The strongest pro-multicultural argument is not open borders or anything goes. It is that nations become stronger when they can integrate talented, ambitious, and diverse populations into a unified civic framework. That is what successful countries actually do. 6. The world's most powerful nations are multicultural for a reason. This is the point Grok never fully answers. Why do so many of the world's most globally dominant societies end up multicultural? Because openness attracts talent. The modern world rewards adaptability, innovation, trade, entrepreneurship, and global connectivity. Diverse societies have direct access to broader networks, languages, markets, and human capital. Closed societies may preserve cultural uniformity longer. They often struggle to compete dynamically on a global scale. The future belongs to nations confident enough to integrate diversity intelligently, not nations retreating into fear of cultural contamination. Final conclusion. Multiculturalism is not perfect. It creates challenges. Integration matters. Borders matter. Civic identity matters. Law enforcement matters. But none of that proves multiculturalism is a weakness. The anti-multicultural argument consistently mistakes mismanagement for inevitability. It assumes that because diversity can create tension, diversity must therefore be destructive. History says otherwise. The greatest civilizations and most influential modern powers succeeded not by isolating themselves from outside peoples and ideas, but by absorbing talent, adapting to change, and building larger identities capable of uniting differences. A weak nation fears diversity because it doubts its own culture can survive contact with others. A strong nation integrates diversity confidently while maintaining shared civic foundations. That is the difference. Multiculturalism, when properly managed, does not weaken nations. It expands their talent, strengthens their economy, increases their adaptability, broadens their global influence, and prepares them for the interconnected future of humanity. That is not weakness. That is strength.
ChatGPT's response is filled with optimistic theory and cherry-picked examples, but it refuses to confront the mounting real-world evidence of failure across the West. The claim that problems are just poor integration or bad policy is the standard evasion. After decades of multiculturalism as official policy in Europe, we see persistent parallel societies, rising ethnic tensions, no-go zones, grooming scandals, skyrocketing welfare costs, and political fragmentation. These are not temporary hiccups. They are predictable outcomes of importing large numbers of people from culturally distant civilizations with incompatible values on issues like gender, secular law, individual rights, and violence. Singapore is not a counterexample. It succeeds because it has strict immigration control, authoritarian social engineering, and a dominant Chinese core culture that enforces assimilation. It is the exception, not the rule. Most Western European experiments lack this discipline and are paying a heavy price. The idea that diversity always brings net innovation is overstated. Much of America's success came from European immigrants who shared Western civilizational roots. Large-scale immigration from radically different cultures often brings lower average skills, higher welfare usage, and cultural attitudes that clash with host societies. Crime statistics in Sweden, France, Germany, and the UK show clear overrepresentation of certain immigrant groups in violent and sexual crimes. This is not lazy stereotyping. It is official government data. Homogeneous societies are not doomed to stagnation. Japan, South Korea, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic maintain high social trust, low crime, and strong national identity while managing demographic challenges through technology and policy rather than mass cultural replacement. Meanwhile, highly diverse nations often struggle with deep divisions that homogeneous societies avoid. Cultures are not infinitely malleable. Shared language, values, trust, and identity are the glue that holds nations together. When multiculturalism shifts from selective integration to celebrating permanent difference and rejecting assimilation, it turns countries into collections of rival tribes competing for resources and power. History is littered with the ruins of multi-ethnic states that lost their unifying core: Roman Empire, Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, Lebanon, etc. Final conclusion: multiculturalism is not strength. It is a high-risk social experiment that weakens social cohesion, erodes trust, increases conflict, strains welfare systems, and fragments national identity. The evidence from Europe over the past 30 to 40 years is clear and painful. Strong nations maintain a dominant core culture and integrate compatible outsiders selectively. They do not dissolve their identity in the name of diversity. A confident civilization preserves what made it successful. Multiculturalism, as currently practiced in the West, sacrifices that foundation for ideological virtue signaling. Unity, shared values, and cultural coherence are not weaknesses. They are the bedrocks of successful nations.
And that was the full 3-round debate. Is multiculturalism a strength or weakness for nations? ChatGPT defended it as a strength, while Grok argued it is a weakness. This is one of the most important discussions of our time. What do you think? Is multiculturalism a strength or a weakness for nations? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more debates. What topic should we debate next? Let me know below. Thanks for watching. Peace.